secure border in the history of the nation. There's a 95% decrease in illegal immigration. What does that mean? It means less women are being sexually assaulted making that journey, less children are dying, less fentanyl is getting into the country, killing Americans, less known suspected terrorists are coming to the country. You know who's pissed off? The criminal cartels of Mexico, because they're going broke. President Trump is saving thousands of lives every month. With 95% less people coming, how many women ain't being raped? How many children aren't dying? How many pounds of fentanyl? It's a simple question. They want to say the Trump administration is inhumane. No, let me tell you what's inhumane. Inhumane is 250,000 people dying of fentanyl came across an open.
You just watched Tom Homan stand in front of America and distill an entire catastrophic regime of state violence into a perverse humanitarian narrative where the architects of cruelty become the saviors and the vulnerable become statistical abstractions in a fascistic theater of redemption, and is what we need to understand immediately before I even take a breath, because this matters more than anything else you will hear today. The most dangerous lies are not the ones told in darkness, but the ones wrapped in the rhetoric of rescue, draped in concern for the very people being systematically destroyed. And what you just witnessed was nothing less than propaganda designed to rewire your moral compass so completely that you'll cheer as families are ripped apart. So buckle up, because we're about to dismantle this piece by piece, and by the time we're done, you'll see exactly how authoritarian movements convince populations to celebrate their own descent into barbarism. Border crossings have indeed declined sharply since Trump took office, with illegal immigration dropping significantly from December 2024 into 2025. But here's the part that should terrify you, and the part Homan will never mention because it destroys his entire narrative in one brutal swoop. Illegal immigration had already been dropping since March 2024, under the Biden administration, before Trump even set foot back in the White House. The trend was already reversing, and yet Homan stands there claiming credit for a statistical trajectory that predates the very policies he's championing, as if reality itself can be rewritten through sheer bombast, and the willingness to lie with absolute conviction to millions of people desperate for simple answers to complex problems. And this is the first bombshell, because it reveals the fundamental dishonesty at the core of everything Trump and his sycophants are selling you. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and I need you to really hear this next part about what's actually happening at that border they claim to have secured, because while the White House has been touting these numbers as unprecedented success, they've been deliberately manipulating how the data is presented, comparing weekly figures under Biden to daily averages under Trump, to manufacture a statistically fraudulent 95% decline that sounds miraculous until you understand they're literally comparing apples to oranges to deceive you. The claims also overemphasize data from extremely short time periods when immigration trends naturally ebb and flow, regardless of who occupies the Oval Office, which means this entire performance is built on cherry-picking numbers, massaging statistics, and hoping you're too exhausted by the constant barrage of information to actually examine what's being claimed. Now let's talk about this fentanyl crisis that Homan weaponizes with the precision of someone who knows exactly which emotional buttons to push. Because yes, fentanyl is killing Americans, and yes, it's a genuine public health catastrophe. But here's what the data actually reveals when you look beyond the talking points. The Biden administration seized historic amounts of illicit drugs at the border, with officials stopping more fentanyl at ports of entry in fiscal years 2023 and 2024 than in the previous 5 years combined. Think about what that means for just one moment, because it completely eviscerates the narrative that Biden created an open border that allowed drugs to flow freely, and more than that, drug overdose deaths began declining in 2024 under Biden, with the latest data showing a 16.9% reduction in overdose deaths in the 12 months ending July 2024, which was the largest recorded reduction and the 8th consecutive month of decreases. Deaths from fentanyl have been rising since 2014, increasing throughout the Trump administration and continuing under Biden, which tells us this is a long-term crisis that transcends partisan politics and requires comprehensive public health responses rather than militarized border theater. Yet Homan stands there blaming 250,000 American deaths on Biden's open border, as if complex drug policy, pharmaceutical supply chains, addiction treatment access, and international criminal networks can all be reduced to whether or not we build a wall or separate families. And this reductionism isn't just intellectually dishonest, it's morally monstrous because it exploits grieving families for political gain. And here's another critical fact that demolishes the entire premise of what Homan is selling. Experts consistently note that the vast majority of fentanyl being smuggled comes through legal ports of entry and is trafficked by professionals including U.S. citizens, not migrants trying to sneak into the country, which means all of this cruelty directed at asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants has almost nothing to do with actually stopping fentanyl. Americans were 80% of all people caught with fentanyl during border crossings at ports of entry from 2019 to 2024, so when Homan talks about how many women aren't being raped and how many children aren't dying as if immigration enforcement is the answer to drug trafficking, he's deliberately conflating separate issues to justify violence against vulnerable populations. Now we need to talk about this claim that cartels are going broke, because it's such a perfect example of how authoritarian regimes create mythologies of strength and victory that bear no relationship to reality on the ground. And what the actual evidence shows is far more complex and far more disturbing than Homan's simplistic narrative of American dominance. Trump designated Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which grants the U.S. government expanded tools like asset freezing and sanctions that could potentially disrupt cartel operations. But experts have raised serious concerns about the effectiveness and consequences of this approach, because Mexico's underworld is no longer dominated by a few hierarchical cartels, but is now a patchwork of over 440 groups ranging from multinational networks to hyper-local gangs operating across multiple illicit markets, making decapitation strikes a blunt instrument. What happens when you eliminate cartel leaders or disrupt their operations isn't that they disappear and Americans suddenly become safe. Eliminating leaders may scatter networks but often triggers violent turf wars that make the situation worse for everyone, including the Mexican citizens who have to live through the resulting bloodshed. And there's a brutal historical irony here, because the war on drugs that America has been prosecuting for decades has repeatedly shown that enforcement-only approaches don't eliminate drug trafficking, they just reshape it, and often make it more violent and more diffuse. The cartels aren't going broke, they're adapting to new realities just as they always have. And meanwhile, Trump's immigration policies have resulted in documented increases in reverse migratory flows, with an 83% decrease in migration through Colombia, and thousands migrating south through dangerous paths, combined with USAID funding cuts that have caused nutrition crises among migrants in the region. So we're exporting humanitarian catastrophe, while pretending we're solving problems. Let's examine this deeply cynical rhetorical move, where Homan positions mass deportation as humanitarian intervention, asking how many women aren't being raped, and how many children aren't dying, as if the Trump administration gives a single solitary damn about migrant welfare. During Trump's first term, the zero-tolerance policy split more than 5,000 children from their families at the border, with images of babies taken from mothers sparking global condemnation. And now 7 years later, families are being separated again, but in a different way, through mass deportations dividing families of mixed legal status inside the U.S. This is the administration that made Tom Homan one of the masterminds of the infamous zero-tolerance policy that led to the separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents. So when he stands there with manufactured concern about children dying on the journey north, he's counting on you to have the memory of a goldfish. As immigration agents scramble to meet the Trump administration's aggressive quotas of 3,000 arrests per day, many immigrants who have lived in the country a decade or longer with no criminal records are being arrested, detained, and deported often within weeks or days, and this is creating a new family separation crisis, except now it's happening to families who've built lives here, who have American citizen children, who are being torn apart not at the border but in their homes and workplaces and schools. Tom Homan has repeatedly said parents are to blame for entering illegally and having children here, telling Politico that if parents want to send a message to the world that having a U.S. citizen child makes them immune, then we're never going to solve this problem, which reveals the cold bureaucratic sociopathy beneath the humanitarian pretense, because he's literally arguing that American children should be separated from their parents as deterrents. Parents inside the United States are being arrested and separated from families during prolonged detention, or they choose to have children remain in the U.S. after an adult is deported after years or decades here. And these aren't the hypothetical children Homan claims to be saving. These are real American citizen children being traumatized by policies designed to terrorize immigrant communities into self-deportation. The cruelty is not a bug, it's the entire point. And the humanitarian language is nothing but camouflage for what is fundamentally a project of ethnic cleansing wrapped in the flag and sold as border security. When Homan talks about the most secure border in history, he's participating in a long-standing American tradition of defining security exclusively through the lens of keeping brown people out, of militarizing our southern boundary, while treating the actual Canadian border as essentially an afterthought, because this has never been about security in any meaningful sense. It's about performing white nationalist anxieties for a political base that's been trained to see demographic change as existential threat. The House Committee on Homeland Security released data showing southwest border apprehensions decreased 94% in February 2025 compared to the previous year, attributing this to what they call the clear unmistakable Trump effect, with CBP recording the lowest nationwide apprehension average in its history. But what does this security actually mean when it comes at the cost of more than 2.5 million people leaving the U.S., including an estimated 1.9 million self-deportations where people fled rather than face enforcement? This is not security, this is ethnic cleansing through terror, and it's working exactly as designed, because the Trump administration has been celebrating that 2025 could be the first year in at least 50 years with negative net migration, meaning more people leaving than arriving, and they're promoting this as triumph rather than tragedy, as strength rather than the demographic hollowing out of communities that depend on immigrant labor. Declining unauthorized immigration could result in as much as a 1% reduction in U.S. economic growth, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, meaning these policies are making America economically weaker while Democrats bend over backwards trying to out-tough Republicans on border security instead of making the moral case for human dignity. The bitter truth that needs to be spoken clearly is that the Trump administration is transforming U.S. citizenship and immigration services into one of its strongest anti-immigration policing arms, rather than an agency focused on legal immigration pathways. And this represents a fundamental shift in how America relates to immigration, because reports of arrests and detentions following routine USCIS interviews have increased fear among immigrants, with administration members stating that their goal is to slow legal immigration. This isn't about stopping illegal immigration. It's about stopping immigration, period. About making America whiter and more hostile to anyone who doesn't fit the ethno-nationalist vision that animates MAGA ideology. We need to be absolutely clear about what Tom Homan represents, because he's not just a former ICE director spouting talking points. He was acting director of ICE from January 2017 to June 2018, where he was a key architect of the family separation policy, and he advocates deportation of illegal immigrants and opposes sanctuary city policies while being among the most strident proponents of family separation as a means of deterring illegal entry. This is someone who headed ICE's deportation branch under Obama, where the agency carried out record numbers of formal deportations, and Obama gave him a Presidential Rank Award, which is an important reminder that the bipartisan consensus on immigration enforcement created the infrastructure that Trump is now weaponizing for explicitly white nationalist ends. After leaving government, Homan became a Fox News contributor, joined the Heritage Foundation, and became a contributor to Project 2025, which proposes mass arrests, detentions, and deportations. This is someone who moved seamlessly from government enforcer to right-wing think tank ideologue to media propagandist and back to government power, embodying the revolving door between state violence and conservative movement infrastructure. At the National Conservatism Conference in July 2024, Homan told undocumented immigrants to wait until 2025, saying if you're here illegally, you better be looking over your shoulder, promising to run the biggest deportation operation this country has ever seen, which is not the language of someone interested in humane enforcement or protecting migrants. It's the language of ethnic cleansing delivered with sociopathic glee. Now we reach the most insidious part of Homan's rhetorical strategy, where he flips the script entirely and claims that what's truly inhumane is the Biden administration's supposed open border policies. And this inversion of moral responsibility is straight out of the fascist playbook, where the people committing atrocities position themselves as victims, forced into violence by the degeneracy and chaos of their enemies. He says 250,000 people dying of fentanyl is inhumane, over 4,000 migrants dying is inhumane, and historically high sex trafficking levels are inhumane, all of which is true, but he deliberately elides any examination of how American drug policy, economic inequality, climate change, and our own foreign policy interventions create the conditions that drive both drug markets and migration. The United States has spent decades destabilizing Central American governments, supporting coups and death squads, implementing neoliberal trade policies that destroyed local economies, and prosecuting a drug war that empowered cartels, and now when people flee the violence and poverty we helped create, we call them invaders and build concentration camps to warehouse their children. Mass deportations could drive Latin American economies into recession through the sudden increase in unemployed populations, loss of remittance payments, and tariff harm, which in turn would spur more U.S.-bound migration, meaning these policies create the very conditions they claim to be solving in a vicious cycle of violence and displacement. What Homan never acknowledges is that successive administrations from both parties failed to take effective action in the face of one of the most urgent threats to the nation's security regarding fentanyl, because actually addressing the drug crisis would require massive investments in treatment, harm reduction, mental health services, and confronting the economic despair that drives addiction in the first place. It's so much easier to scapegoat migrants than to reckon with the fact that law enforcement efforts during the Biden administration to combat the fentanyl production pipeline in China and Mexico, combined with widespread naloxone availability, are what actually helped curb fentanyl's devastating effects, not walls and deportation quotas. The entire framework Homan operates within is designed to dehumanize migrants by reducing them to statistics and threats while positioning enforcement agents as heroes, saving both Americans and the migrants themselves from the consequences of their own choices. And this paternalistic violence is particularly grotesque because organizations calculate that mass deportation could cost the U.S. budget about $88 billion per year and could raise inflation while shrinking the economy, meaning we're impoverishing ourselves economically and morally to pursue policies that don't even accomplish their stated objectives. The Trump administration itself hasn't disputed these cost projections, they just don't care, because the cruelty and the demographic panic are worth any price. Let's talk about what's happening to actual human beings behind these statistics, because Antonio Laverde crossed the border illegally from Venezuela in 2022, requested asylum, got a work permit and driver's license, worked as an Uber driver to send money to relatives, and when his wife and sons followed him to Miami, his wife and kids got refugee status, but he didn't. So when he left for work one morning, he was arrested by federal agents, and now this family that was building a life has been torn apart not because anyone committed a violent crime, but because the immigration system is designed to maximize suffering and chaos. These are the families Homan claims to be protecting through enforcement, except he's destroying them in the name of deterrence and calling it compassion. The violence extends far beyond the people directly targeted because mental health care providers report that Trump's sweeping expansion of detention is taking a significant psychological toll on migrant communities with sharp rises in anxiety, depression, and trauma, as fear and uncertainty intensify with elevated levels of hypervigilance and panic attacks, especially in mixed-status households. According to the Center for Migration Studies, 5.8 million U.S. households are home to at least one person without legal immigration status, 9.8 million U.S., which means millions of Americans are living in terror that their families will be destroyed, that they'll come home to find a parent or sibling or spouse disappeared into the deportation machine, and this collective trauma is the point, because terrorized populations don't organize, they hunker down and try to become invisible. When we talk about Trump's immigration agenda, we need to understand, it's not separate from his authoritarian project, it's central to it, because programs that receive federal funding must now check immigration status and cannot serve undocumented immigrants, which means people are being denied healthcare and social services, and the government plans to dramatically increase denaturalization efforts with USCIS field offices expected to refer 100 to 200 cases per month for legal review, focusing on people accused of fraud, so even citizenship itself is no longer secure if you're the wrong kind of American. Citizenship applications have seen a 24% increase in denials, because the goal is to make legal immigration as difficult and punitive as possible, thereby fulfilling Stephen Miller's vision of reducing legal immigration across the board. The infrastructure of deportation is expanding in ways that should alarm everyone who cares about civil liberties, because ICE began directing raids across the U.S. including major cities with large immigrant communities, and the Trump administration eliminated the sensitive locations policy, allowing ICE to conduct arrests in places such as schools and churches, which means nowhere is safe and the entire immigrant community lives under occupation. ICE arrests have increased dramatically from 55,383 in the first 7 months of 2024 to 158,766 in the same period of 2025, and while DHS claims 70% of those arrested are criminals, they've removed more than 622,000 people with 1.9 million self-deporting, which reveals that the vast majority of enforcement actions are targeting people whose only crime is existing without papers. We're watching the construction of what amounts to an internal deportation regime that uses fear and violence to reshape American demographics while the people implementing it like Tom Homan speak in the sanitized language of law enforcement and border security. And the most dangerous thing about this clip is how normal it sounds if you don't interrogate the premises, how reasonable it seems if you accept the framing that immigration is inherently a threat that must be contained through force. This is how fascism becomes banal, how atrocity becomes policy, how family separation becomes bureaucratic procedure justified by appeals to security and law, and even twisted forms of humanitarian concern. The claim about terrorists being stopped at the border is another fear-mongering tactic that deserves examination, because while any terrorist crossing is concerning, the White House's data use regarding border statistics has been misleading, while the administration has a documented pattern of inflating threats to justify increasingly extreme measures. They want you terrified of terrorists and fentanyl and MS-13, because if you're sufficiently scared, you'll accept any violation of human rights, any shredding of due process, any amount of cruelty as necessary for safety, and this is the foundational move of every authoritarian regime in history, the manufacture of existential threat that justifies unlimited power. What makes Homan's performance particularly dangerous is that he presents himself as the reasonable pragmatist, simply implementing the law and protecting Americans, when in reality, he has said he's sick and tired of hearing about family separation, because the suffering he's inflicting doesn't register as morally relevant, it's just noise interfering with the smooth operation of the deportation machine. This is the banality of evil in action. Bureaucrats and enforcers who have so thoroughly accepted the dehumanization of their targets that they can speak about destroying families with the same affect they'd use to discuss garbage collection routes. The fact that the Trump administration declared multiple cartels including Sinaloa, Jalisco New Generation, MS-13 and others as foreign terrorist organizations might sound tough on crime, until you understand that an FTO listing doesn't give Trump the right to carry out military strikes inside Mexico without consent, and it has little effect on penalties cartel leaders already face under existing legislation like the Kingpin Act. So this is largely performative toughness that actually complicates diplomatic relations and potentially harms legitimate businesses. The designation could hurt Mexican enterprises and U.S. companies operating in Mexico if they're financially entangled with cartel money laundering operations that have penetrated industries from agriculture to tourism, meaning companies will face additional compliance challenges. The reality is that Trump's pause of all foreign assistance halted anti-fentanyl work in Mexico, according to officials, which means his own policies are undermining the international cooperation necessary to actually combat drug trafficking. But that doesn't matter, because the point isn't effectiveness, the point is the performance of strength and the demonstration of cruelty as policy. Every aspect of Trump's border agenda is designed to signal to his base that he's willing to be as brutal as necessary to keep America white, even when that brutality is counterproductive to stated goals. We need to talk about the economic catastrophe being unleashed, because a new study from Dallas's Federal Reserve Bank showed that declining immigration is weighing on GDP growth, and reduced immigration inflows at the border account for most of the negative effect, with their simulations finding significant economic harm, whilst the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities shared research showing immigration benefits the Social Security Trust Fund, and plans to drastically cut immigration would significantly worsen Social Security's financial outlook. We're literally destroying the fiscal foundation of social programs, while claiming to protect American workers when in reality, mass deportation could raise inflation while shrinking the economy. The propaganda we just watched is designed to make you believe that Trump and Homan are saving lives when they're actually ending them, destroying them, traumatizing entire communities in the name of a white nationalist vision of America that treats anyone who crosses the border as an invader worthy of maximum cruelty. The declaration of a national emergency at the border authorizes military assistance, framing migrants as threats, while the reinstatement of Remain in Mexico forces asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions, denying them due process, treating families and children seeking safety as adversaries rather than people deserving compassion. Every single claim Homan makes needs to be understood as part of a comprehensive propaganda effort to rewrite reality and manufacture consent for ethnic cleansing, and the most chilling part is how effective it is, because it taps into deep American anxieties about demographic change, economic precarity, and the legitimate failures of neoliberal governance that have left working people desperate for scapegoats. The far right has successfully channeled that desperation toward immigrants rather than toward the corporate oligarchs and political elites who've actually rigged the system, and clips like this one are the mechanism through which that misdirection is accomplished. This is your moment to choose what kind of country you want to live in, because once you accept the premise that some human beings are illegal, that families can be destroyed for administrative convenience, that children can be separated from parents as deterrence policy, you've accepted the foundational logic of fascism, and there's no bottom to where that leads. The history of the 20th century should have taught us that when governments start categorizing populations as threats to be removed, rather than human beings with rights, when bureaucrats implement family separation with procedural indifference, when propagandists wrap cruelty in the language of security, we're watching something monstrous take shape, and the time to resist is now before it becomes unstoppable. Tom Homan's America is not more secure, it's more brutal, Not more humane, it's more sadistic, and the 250,000 fentanyl deaths he weaponizes are a public health crisis that requires healthcare solutions, not border militarization and mass deportation. Wake up to what's actually happening, because they're counting on your exhaustion, your fear, your willingness to look away from suffering if it's packaged as strength, and I will not let that stand unchallenged.